Welcome to the Future of Life Institute podcast. My name is Gus Docker, and I'm here with Tom Barnes. Tom is an applied researcher at Founders Pledge. He's also an expert advisor to the UK government on AI policy, and he's the author of the new report, Navigating Advanced AI. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Gus. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. Okay. One conclusion you reach in your new report is that you write, for every $1 invested in making AI systems safe, $250 is invested in making AI systems more capable. So how did you arrive at that ratio?
Yeah, it's quite a concerning ratio. I think this came from looking at trends in philanthropy and in private investment in AI through 2023. So I think in 2023, we saw about $100 million spent by philanthropists. And in comparison, something like $25 billion spent on building generative AI systems. Of course, there are caveats to that number. Some would argue it could be slightly lower. I think, if anything, it's a conservative estimate. And now in 2024 and looking 2025 and beyond, people are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, maybe even trillions of dollars spent building these systems. Meanwhile, in the philanthropic space and in the general safety space, things have really stagnated, if not declined. If you think about OpenAI, we're committing to spending 20% of their budget on super alignment, which is now no longer seems to be the case. And so, I think at best, there is $1 spent on safety for 250 on capabilities.
And so is this ratio arrived at only by looking at philanthropic investments into AI safety research versus investments into AI companies, or could you also look at how companies are spending their money? You mentioned OpenAI's commitment to spend 20% of their compute on super alignment, and that this commitment is uncertain now. But would you also guess that the ratio is 1 to 250 if you include money spent by the companies building AGI?
Yeah, it's a good question. Unfortunately, it's not super clear how much they are spending, and even the division between safety and capabilities is controversial. I mean, I think if you look at the staffing of, say DeepMind and Anthropic, they have a substantial staff number on safety. I wouldn't know exactly, but I would guess on the order of 10 to 20% of staff. But then OpenAI, it seems much smaller more recently. Many of them have left, and many other companies at the frontier simply really do not have a team focused on frontier risks from AI. So, I would guess it's on a similar order of magnitude, perhaps 100 to 1 on the terms of the company's own investments on the frontier. But of course, there's so much more being invested in many different parts of AI. And then on the safety side of things, outside philanthropy, it's really quite small. Governments have started to make some commitments. So the UK government committed to £100 million back in 2023 for the AI task force, now the AI Safety Institute, and a couple of other sort of commitments have been made, but still we're talking much, much smaller than the capability side.
Do you think the 1 to 250 ratio also holds for talent, so employees working on capabilities versus employees working on safety?
Yeah, again, I'm not totally sure, but I would guess on that order of magnitude. If you look at the amount of people working on these sort of issues in companies, I would guess similarly, we see the same on talent there. So we're talking like 2 orders of magnitude at least. I think maybe even 3, depending on your view of particular talent. And if we include non-frontier AI research as well, certainly it's even more in that direction.
Yeah, one complication here that you actually mentioned is that it's sometimes difficult to disentangle safety work from work on capabilities. Perhaps a good example here is that reinforcement learning from human feedback makes models more useful and helpful to people. And this also helps in commercializing these models and increasing revenue, and it makes them more capable in a certain sense. So even though reinforcement learning from human feedback was originally conceived as a sort of alignment technique, it turned out to also increase capabilities, one could argue. Do you think is this a general trend across safety techniques? Could it perhaps turn out that our work or the work that's been done on interpretability turns out to increase capabilities also?
Yeah, I think it is a messy topic. I think interpretability, for example, could be, again, something that it's very helpful to know what your AI system is doing if you want to make it safe, because you want to know if maybe it's deceptively aligned, maybe it's has scheming in some sense. But you also want to know what it's doing because you have commercial applications to it. You want to know if really understanding particular concepts in whatever sector you're deploying it in. And so it's inherently a dual use sense, or a capabilities and safety sense. And I think the real important point to take from that is not that this is necessarily bad, net negative, although it could be, but more that like on the margin, this is just like not the most useful thing to do. There are some really important topics that are much more neglected that don't enhance capabilities, but are important for safety. So, fundamentally, like AGI safety and concerns about power-seeking AI, concerns about foundational theoretical work on whether AI systems will converge on certain goals. Like those are questions which don't really have a commercial application in the same way that something like RLHF does, but it's fundamentally an essential part of being able to align like superhuman systems. So yeah, we really sort of in the report focus on what are companies likely to do and are doing, and what are they not doing.
And what's an example of something that companies are not doing?
Yeah, so I mean, even with interpretability, we do see Anthropic doing this to some extent, DeepMind to some extent, but it's pretty limited. And then in the real sort of like niche parts, more theoretical work, I think. If you think about like previously, agent foundations was a particular focus of the safety community, which seems to have fallen by the wayside. And more broadly, just thinking about like how goal-directed systems might consider seeking power. I think some research does take place on this. For example, at Redwood Research, they do like work on control, but this is still not in the companies, and so those are the sort of areas where I'm particularly concerned that there's like a missing space.
You also mentioned in the report that work on inner misalignment might be lacking at AGI Corporation. So what is inner misalignment? How does it differ from outer misalignment? Why is it not funded?
Yeah, so I think this taxonomy comes from Miri, and some people might disagree about this like sort of typology, but broadly, inner misalignment is understood to be a situation where the AI, we try and align it to a particular set of goals, but when it like generalizes, it might do so poorly. So it might misunderstand the goal we gave it. In contrast to maybe outer alignment, which is the question more of value alignment. Is it doing the thing that is truly in our best interest? At least this is my interpretation of this split. So on the inner side of things, this is more of a technical question, which we don't really see right now in the same way outer alignment is more visual and more visceral as a concern. And so again, we might expect commercial incentives to solve this problem, quote unquote, like one can, more likely than in inner issues like goal misgeneralization, and I think like deep deceptive alignment issues are more likely to occur on that sort of bucket. So yeah, that would be, if we're going to split the sort of the alignment space in those sort of two halves, I would really think the inner side of things is much more neglected, much more concerning, and perhaps harder to work on, but also like where the real threat comes from.
Although if we imagine that some corporation trains a system and during testing it performs as expected, but then during deployment it performs in ways that are unexpected by the company. And so that's perhaps an example of inner misalignment. Isn't it in the company's interest to prevent something like that before deployment? Isn't it the case that the companies have commercial interests to also do inner misalignment?
There certainly is a commercial case for doing so, and we would hope that they will spend resource both on the outer and inner misalignment, simply because if it's deployed poorly and initially performs well on testing and training, but then later has failures, then we would hope that they would also invest in this. But I think just empirically, we see that companies are spending most of their time on sort of scalable oversight methods that are primarily outer focused and less thinking about these more theoretical concerns post deployment. And then, of course, I guess with truly superhuman systems, maybe failures in deployment are perhaps too late to repair. So I think that's a real area where it might be too late. And so maybe the difference is not so substantive between these two, outer and inner, in terms of incentives, but I nonetheless think that, inner is more likely to be neglected.
Yeah, so the classic story of why companies are not investing in safety as much as they perhaps should is that they are in a race with their competition, and their incentives are to spend most of their capital, most of their talent trying to get ahead. And therefore, they're incentivized to cut corners on safety. So when you did this in-depth report, did you find evidence of this kind of classic story? Are there any perhaps points we're missing when we lay out the story like I just did?
Yeah, I think the strongest evidence, to be honest, is just the words of the people running these companies. It's many of them say, we believe that AI could be catastrophic or existential. I'm thinking about like Sam Altman said that, this could be like lights out for all of us. Dario Amodei has said like, I can't remember exactly his P doom, but it was, certainly above 10%, maybe 25% on that order. But, despite that, these companies are racing ahead to build these systems. So I think the only explanation for why one would rationally do this, if they really believe these numbers, is concern that, maybe someone else will do it instead. So even in a sort of safety motivated context, they are still racing ahead to try and prevent the other one from causing this harm. And I think this is like a classic prisoner's dilemma situation where one is thinking, well, if I don't do it, it will be worse. So yeah, I think you can infer a lot just from hearing what these companies are saying and these CEOs, if we take them at their word, of course.
Yeah. And then we have perhaps some tools from economics and game theory for trying to solve a coordination problem like this, or prisoner's dilemma problem like this. But it doesn't seem like it's being solved. At least it's not solved yet. Why isn't that happening?
Yeah, I think if we look at like sort of classic cases of this previously in other parts of economics and also political theory of prisoner's dilemmas, like often the solution is government intervention, is government regulation. This often like solves many of these coordination problems. So on the domestic level, requiring companies to meet some kind of minimum standards to not like have externalities. This is like quite a common thing across many different sectors. So on the domestic level, between these different companies, there is like this question that like only a government can really answer. Of course, like companies can informally make commitments to each other and meet and try and coordinate, but most often we see that ultimately it's government that has to step in. And then the second side to this coin is, of course, on the international level. So again, we have US and China who are also in this kind of competitive mindset, who are already thinking that they have to beat the other, they have to build the technology first, even though they both also really think this is a threat. So we recently saw in China, several ASAP scientists coming out and saying they're concerned. Reports of the CCP internally, really being concerned, and the counter often being, but we have to beat the US, which is exactly the parallel of what we see in the US. So again, the same situation here, a prisoner's dilemma. And again, the solution is often international governance, forums, dialogues, summits, treaties. That I think is the only way we're going to avoid the same kind of racing dynamics.
So perhaps this would be my summary of the situation. The governments, say in US and China and the UK and so on, they perceive that it's perhaps not in their interest to regulate their companies strongly, because that would hamper them in the international race between countries. And internationally, we don't really have an organization or an institution that can enforce treaties or agreements between countries in a very strong and substantial way. So that is perhaps the somewhat tragic situation we find ourselves in. Do you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, I think on the international stage, it is much more concerning. There is no kind of overarching governance body in the same way we have on the domestic level. But I think there are still some glimmers of hope. So we have had the AI Safety Summit in the UK and then Korea, and one coming up in France. And although the focus on like frontier safety is still watered down a little, it is being discussed. And I think, I'd love to move towards a world of like, the UN or some other kind of international governance fora where these companies would come together, these countries would come together and sort of see this as like a collective project. I think this is somewhat idealistic at the moment, but there are still steps that can be made right now which can really address this. And I think in particular, focusing on that US-China relation, the really positive dialogues between sort of AI safety researchers in the US and China who are sort of doing this outside of government Interact 2 dialogues. So I think that's a real sort of glimmer of hope.
One problem with safety work at companies is that it perhaps over time tends to transform or be replaced by work on PR for the companies and making sure that you could call it making sure that the companies are perceived well by the public, as opposed to tackling fundamental issues of alignment and control over these systems. Do you have an explanation for that? Why might that be happening?
Yeah, I think we certainly do see it happening. I think Yudkowsky says something like, we should only call it AI not kill everyoneism, because it is the only way that we can make it clear what is being meant here. But I think there's certainly safety washing happening in the companies and in government. Like I mentioned previously about the AI Safety Summit in the UK, that's now become an AI Action Summit in France. And so even subtly, you can see this like focus on safety and frontier safety being slowly eroded away. I don't think there is a real good way to combat this other than to sort of call it out and just say, like, when there is like this backsliding happening, and really sort of question people, what are they talking about when they say safety.
So your report, the focus there is to find out what philanthropists can do with their money in order to support work on AI alignment and AI safety in general. To what extent do you think it's possible to work outside of the major AGI corporations on these safety issues? I'm thinking in small research organizations, how effectively can such organizations contribute? The story I sometimes hear is that it's difficult to contribute outside of the corporations because you need access to the models that are most advanced. You need enormous compute budgets. And this discrepancy between resources at the corporations and resources at, say, research organizations, it's only getting larger over time.
Yeah, I think it is a concern. And I think one needs to look at like where the levers of like sort of mitigating these risks are. The first is definitely these companies themselves, building out alignment techniques, thinking about sort of safety cases. But the second is also governments more increasingly. So we have the AI Safety Institute in the UK, also now in the US and several other countries. So I think if one wants to work on sort of frontier safety, they don't necessarily have to work in these companies, although they do have these large budgets. And then I would go back to the point on thinking about like the commercial incentives for the work done in these companies, so that we're working on RLHF and scale alignment and similar techniques, but they won't be thinking maybe about more theoretical work on work that'll work for only super intelligent systems. And to the extent that one can, I think working, in small groups can be really, really quite effective here. And I think certainly it would be a mistake to just focus on the companies. We also emphasize all the working AI policy and AI governance that is essential here too. And so, I would see only like companies as one small part of this problem and increasingly focus on government.
Yeah. And maybe we should take a step back and think about why are we even talking about AI safety and alignment? This is because we perhaps foresee some risks from AI. And my listeners will have heard the case for why advanced AI could become dangerous before, but I think it's important to hear it from different angles. What do you think are the key risks from advanced AI, and how would you rank them in terms of importance?
In the report we just published, we go through a few, which your listeners will probably be familiar with many of these. But I think like number one, this like concern about like misaligned AI systems, power-seeking AI systems. So what do I mean by that? I mean systems which more advanced than humans in effectively every domain, whose goals are not aligned with the goals of their creators. So they have different intentions and they have a different propensity to their creators. And in pursuit of those different goals, they want to converge on particular instrumental goals. So if you wanted to seek power through collecting money, through resources, through acquiring more capabilities themselves, and maybe having some kind of feedback loop. So this instrumental convergence case, which has been made sort of many times before, means you have the systems both more powerful than you and having intentions misaligned with yours, which if they execute on that, would essentially leave humans in the dust. I want to caveat that this does not necessarily mean just extinction. It could mean that humans are left extinct from AIs, but it also could mean that humans are left alone. They could just be potentially unable to affect the long-term future. And even if humans are fairly happy and healthy on Earth, they will lose meaningful control over the long-term future. So it's not just about extinction, although that is like the central case. So that's like the one that's most sort of classically known. But I think more recently we've seen a lot of discussion about like misuse of AI systems. So for example, AI systems which are capable of maybe assisting people building weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons, AI systems that can be used for cyber attacks. And I think the concern, if you're especially concerned about extreme risks here, is that this could lead to catastrophe, particularly in the case of pandemics, because they can spread sort of globally. And then I think there's like this other sort of massive sort of broad tent of what I would call like democratic and distributional risks. So on the one hand, we could have a scenario where everyone has access to AI systems, fully open source, which could cause catastrophe. That's like one extreme that we want to avoid. The other extreme is that only one or a small number of people have access to these systems, or they're super powerful. They can accumulate vast numbers of wealth and power, and that sort of is inherently concerning for many people's moral systems. You can see how that could lead to totalitarianism, to all sorts of dystopias. And then I'll say a couple more. I guess epistemic insecurity is another one that's often talked about. So today we talk about misinformation, disinformation, and I think if you take that to its extreme, you can imagine scenarios where people really don't know truth from fiction, and that could be a massive risk factor for potential global catastrophes, pandemics, etc. And then finally, I think, and one that isn't talked about enough in my view, is this like digital minds and what really happens if we build these AI systems that have some kind of moral welfare, moral value that we forget to consider when we're focusing on these more sort of human-centered risks. So that's what we're talking about in the report. And happy to go into sort of particular ones. In my view, the most concerning right now is probably the power-seeking AI, that misalignment case. But yeah, there's quite a few there.
Do you think these risks will fall on a kind of intuitive timeline? And by intuitive timeline, I mean that perhaps first we might see risks from misuse, and only after we see risks from misuse, we could call it rogue AI or power-seeking AI. Does that make sense, or will things be happening so fast that perhaps these risks overlap in time?
Yeah, I think it is unclear, like the pace of this technology, which unfortunately makes this hard to say. I mean, I think I would bucket into three parts. So risks from AI systems below human level, risks at human level, and risks above human level. So already at below human level, we see AI used for low level misinformation, maybe an election interference. It's already used for like creating imagery that's like sexual exploitation, those kind of concerns. We already see that today. And if you're particularly concerned about catastrophic risks, you could imagine like some of these just being scaled up in terms of extremity. That could be directly concerning. And then I think in the sort of around human level, we might see those misuse risks, like misuse of cyber, misuse of biological weapons. And then I think the above human level, that's where you kind of get to the super intelligence risks. Now, this could all happen over a course of decades. It also could happen over years, months, even between these three stages. So yeah, that's why a key focus of ours is to sort of be pursuing interventions that work across all these risks, because we really don't know for confidence in how likely they are, when they'll occur. So it's best to pursue policies that can really mitigate across all of them.
I think that's key. I also think perhaps cyber attacks using AI is already happening, or it's at least on the horizon. A large language model, for example, might be helpful in trying different ways to hack into a system. And we can imagine cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, and suddenly you have quite large scale risks that seem plausible to me and not far-fetched, and it doesn't require any extrapolation of AI capabilities, at least not any extreme extrapolation of capabilities. So I think in some sense the risks are already here, but of course there's a large difference between talking about using large language models for cyber attacks and then talking about a group of agents or one agent that is misaligned from human values and is more intelligent than we are.
Yeah, I think with that, there's certainly a difference of magnitude rather than difference in type with many of these risks. Like the cyber case, right now it might be humans using LLMs, but maybe in the future it's agentic AI systems being multimodal and pursuing many different pathways. So they're different types of AI, but fundamentally the risk sort of is the same on the same scale, and hence why often the solutions can be on the same scale as well.
But can the solutions work for something as comparatively simple as low-level misinformation today, and on the other end of the spectrum, say, misaligned superintelligence? I'm thinking in terms of what type of solution could work across the whole spectrum, say from low-level misinformation that we see today, generated by AI, all the way to, say, misaligned superintelligence. What type of solutions could cover that whole spectrum?
Yeah, I think the closest thing that comes to my mind in terms of like truly threat agnostic interventions are often the most boring interventions at all, actually. There are real basic things that we could be doing. So one example is setting up whistleblower protections for people working in these companies, whether that's someone concerned about misaligned systems being built or just someone concerned about being used for deep fakes. Similarly, you could set up basic protocols, processes in terms of, for example, let's say you've built a concerning AI system, whether that's concerning for misinformation or because it's misaligned. Fundamentally, that information, maybe it's started by the AI company, but that has to escalate somehow. Somehow they have to inform maybe the government has to internally organize like who is responsible for responding to that. How does it get to the president at 3 a.m.? Does it need to be woken up at the middle of the night? Is it that kind of risk? Like, those are really boring government-y process questions, and they really matter no matter what the risk is, and they're really sort of missing right now. And then I think finally I'll just mention evaluations is a common focus right now. And again, you want to know how capable your AI system is, no matter what that harm particularly is. So those are just some that come to mind that I think are pretty low hanging fruit and are pretty important no matter what the risk is you're focusing on.
Perhaps one other such solution that comes to mind is securing AGI corporations, both from outside threats and from the AI systems escaping, you could say. So when I'm talking about securing AGI corporations, I'm thinking about physical security at the headquarters and at the data centers of these where the models are being trained, but also cybersecurity and trying to prevent anyone from stealing the model weights. But also, perhaps the other side of that coin is to isolate the systems that are working at these corporations, so that the systems can't, for example, get onto the internet or escape in other ways or replicate themselves in other ways. That is slightly less low hanging, and we don't have an exact idea of how we could do that. But something like cybersecurity and of course physical security is something that I think we know how to do. Would you agree that this is in the same bucket of somewhat low hanging fruit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is certainly low hanging fruit, and I think it's certainly one that really applies to a whole range of risks, like you say. So, yeah, the risks that maybe an attacker wants to get into an AI system, and the risks that an AI system wants to get out into the world. I think, like in the same case, you need to have like good info security, good cybersecurity. And I think there's a bunch of lessons to learn here from other sectors. There are governments and sort of companies and academia often has in the past dealt with like these kind of concerns, right? And we have like BSL-4 labs for doing biological research. Although there is a question there about how secure these are, nonetheless, like there exist at least some protocols in the past for these kind of concerning areas. So one thing I would say is like we don't really need to reinvent the wheel with many of this stuff. We don't need to come up with entirely novel infrastructure. On cybersecurity, there's a whole cyberspace to explore, physical infrastructure as well. So whilst this threat is somewhat novel, the solutions don't have to be super difficult. And I think that is also important on the politics and the policy side of things too. When people think, is this threat really real? Is there anything we can do about this? Why are we talking about AI when there are these other risks? I think the answer is often like, well, these are the same kinds of solutions, so we can often pursue them and not in tension with existing other focuses.
Do you think the type of or the level of security we see with biological labs and say nuclear weapons, is that good enough for advanced AI? I'm thinking in terms of we've seen a bunch of near misses with nuclear weapons. We've seen a bunch of failures to secure biological labs. We have imperfect security with both biological labs and nuclear weapons. Can we have such imperfect security with advanced AI?
Yeah, although I don't know so much about the bionuclear cases, my impression is they're not perfect. They're certainly not gold standards, and there are these near miss cases. There are these sort of silly accidents, and separately to AI, I think people should really be thinking about how to close those loopholes. But I think nonetheless, it's bad, but it's not nothing, and we can learn still stuff from those domains, and think how it would ideally be applied in those places, and think how it would ideally apply in the AI case as well.
Okay, great. So we talked about earlier how the solution we might use to prevent an arms race or prevent a race between companies and countries is some form of government or international regulation. In your report, you conclude that governments are not currently prepared for AI risks. Yeah, why is that? And perhaps you could give some specifics to give us a sense of how prepared they are and in what sense they're preparing.
Some of this is informed by my time in the UK government as well over the last few months, but I should caveat that I can't go into super detail on specifically all the ways that we're not ready, because I think that would be bad information to disclose. But yeah, I mean, I certainly in broad strokes, I think you could just look at the resourcing focusing on that question. Like the AI Safety Institute in the UK, for example, has grown quite a lot to 30 people, which is fantastic. All these people are evaluating these systems, but I was on a team of 3 people who were actually thinking, what is the plan if we found a concerning capability? And there's, when I joined, there was one of us, and then I was the second person working on that. So, yeah, I think that gives you a sense of scale about if there's 3 people in the UK government thinking about what do we do if we find concerning issues with AI systems? Like, I hope that sort of like is concerning enough. But I guess I could talk in particular details to some level about a lack of processes, a lack of clear protocols, lack of testing, lack of ways to anticipate these risks. And so I think there's like a whole bunch of sort of gaps which we are like working hopefully to plug. And this is in the UK, and UK is seen as like ahead on this issue compared to the US. So I think probably the US and other countries are behind that. And I think like, as someone who only joined as a secondee, like, part-time and ended up working on this stuff, it really should have concerned me that like that was the case. I really hope there would be established institutions on that. I mean, maybe the slight caveat or the sort of the positive side is there are existing crisis protocols, emergency planning in places, everything from flooding to pandemics already, and there is some level which AI risks can dock into that infrastructure. But nonetheless, the number of people thinking about this is like very, very small.
Yeah, so that's the number of people thinking directly about AI risks and using the terminology and the conceptual frameworks that we also use. But I'm wondering, there's a whole kind of national security establishment, both in the UK and in the US and in basically all countries, where some questions of AI risk might fall into their into the kinds of risks that they handle. Do you have any sense of whether the national security establishment is aware and whether they're taking these kinds of risks seriously?
Yeah, so I think there's certainly broad awareness that these are risks, and I think there are positive signs on that angle. The one sort of negative to that, of course, is like that does not mean that just because people are talking about it and thinking about it means it actually is going to be solved. I think the analogy I would give is if you look at like the COVID response back in sort of February and March 2020, pandemics was talked about loads in the national security communities, in many parts of governments, UK, US, others, and yet we still had a pandemic. And I think those institutions failed like dramatically. So it's one thing to get them to notice this is a problem, but it's a massive challenge to actually get them to solve this problem. And so I would not take comfort just from maybe some people thinking about it, because especially given the complexity of AI systems and the new threat and the lack of government expertise on these problems, that's where sort of my real worry comes from.
There was a moment right after or somewhat after the launch of ChatGPT where there was a lot of attention from world leaders, from governments on AI progress and also AI risks. Do you think the government is limited in its attention span, and perhaps with kind of political election cycles suffers from short-term thinking? Are governments keeping their focus on these issues?
Yeah, I should caveat this that this is personal opinion only, but yes, no, I think that really is like short-sightedness here. I think you're right that, following ChatGPT, we had the FLI letter, of course, and then subsequently many sort of, talking about regulations and safety. And certainly in 2023, we saw the establishment of the AI Safety Institute, very exciting, but priorities change, and then there's other risks in the world, and governments have to divert their attention. And now I think we really do see that sort of starting to happen. AI is still like, a very hot topic in general, but most of the conversation is, how can we use AI to spur innovation, to get economic growth, to make public services work in the UK. And I'm sure in the US, depending on the outcome of the election, we'll see sort of how that debate goes. But it's not clear that either side is specifically focused on frontier risks from AI. Having said that, I think there are positive glimmers in terms of the level of agreement on this issue. So even if it's not at the top of everyone's agenda, there's a widespread agreement that like this is a concern. As say, like the Conservative Party was the one that was in power when I joined, and then the Labour Party has subsequently come in. Both have continued to support the AI Safety Institute. Both have talked about regulatory options for AI. And so the other concern is that we have some kind of warning shot, some kind of event happens where like these AI issues materialize, and whilst that would be tragic, I think there's hopefully an opportunity there to really put this back on the agenda and really say, no, these risks are serious, they're real, and then subsequently get the interventions needed.
I guess if we look from the politician's side, or from the perspective of a world leader, you're faced with an enormous array of potential issues. There are experts warning about all kinds of risks, and maybe there's some reasonableness in being somewhat short-term in your thinking, because the situation is changing so fast that you have to respond to what's in front of you. There are several ongoing wars in the world right now, and so when I speak of the government being somewhat distracted or engaging in short-term thinking, it's not that I can't see that that might be reasonable. It's just that, of course, we are interested in holding the government's attention on the risks from AI.
Yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, politicians have to rush off, sometimes hour to hour, day to day on the sort of the scandal and the news cycle. And I would not expect them to be on top of every risk over the next 10 plus years. Having said that, like I think the level of severity of these risks really needs to be sort of like brought home. The other concerning side, I think, of this is not just the politicians, but often the civil service in the UK and sort of the bureaucracy behind them also suffers from many of the same institutional problems. So short-termist, lacking the right expertise. Many people in the UK government will like move between different sectors. Every year they may spend some time on AI, but they'll move on. So there's lacking depth of specialism there. And so I think one thing I hoped when I would join the government is that there's some secret kind of backdoor where they show you, and it's like this is where the real experts are working with national security risks. And I think like frankly there's not, there really isn't. And so whilst we can sort of like there are issues with politicians not talking about this, but there's also wider institutional failures here.
Do you think the government, or do you think governments in general have trouble attracting a technical talent? And do you see this changing with the new AI safety institutes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a massive challenge, and I think the AI safety institutes are like incredibly rare and impressive that they have been able to attract such like brilliant talent, and it is extremely unusual for government. Most of the time, they would be paid, the people in those experts who are paid far, far less than industry, and whilst they're still underpaid compared to what they could be earning, it's not quite such an extreme disparity. And also in terms of standard bureaucratic rules and processes around hiring can really sort of prevent some of the best people getting in. And you really sort of like see the knock-on effects of that, where policies are discussed, regulations are discussed without technical grounding. And so, I think it's a real concern. But I think credit has to go to the AI Safety Institute in the UK and the US and other places to try and push back against that tendency.
When you're advising the UK government on how to prepare, what is your main message? What do you ask them to focus on? I know you've written about resilience. What does that mean, and how do you bring that up?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the preparedness and resilience work in particular, I'll go back to like, it doesn't really matter which particular risks you're concerned about, nor how likely they are, or even how like when they are likely to arise. The key message is just like, there are basic, simple policies and actions and protocols we can set up now, which are pretty costless. They don't harm innovation. They don't decrease the chance of growth or capabilities. But they really do help. They are basic things. Like I mentioned, when should the prime minister, the president be called at 3 a.m.? Like there should be an answer to that question. There should be a plan. Like what are we going to say to the company if they build a dangerous system? Is it, are we going to ask them to delay their release? Are we going to ask them to delete the model, shut down the model? Like these are basic questions. And whilst there's technical questions too about like how you concretely do those things, there should also be just a basic process thing about who reports to who and how does that information flow. So I think like, again, that's like sort of the pitch is like, this is quite simple and costless. And also that this is like standard, I say pandemic preparedness is very similar, and we should have the same kind of mindset with like AI preparedness.
One thing we haven't mentioned is wargaming exercises. How could doing such exercises help?
Yeah, I think sort of in several ways these can help. So one is just like making visceral to senior officials and politicians what we're talking about, that they can really sit down and feel that weight of responsibility. If it's 2026 and they are responsible for dealing with maybe, let's say that OpenAI has built an AI system, it's tested as like dangerous on cyber or bio risks, and we know this, and they're planning to release it in 2 weeks. Like, what do you, the politician, do? Like, what are your next steps? Really sitting them down and thinking about that. I think that's a real sort of like makes them feel the risk among other things. And then I think there's like direct learnings from that. So you can look at like, what would we ideally do in that kind of scenario? Would we be doing, and what would we currently be doing? And then you notice the gap, and there is a gap, and then you can hopefully close that gap through sort of various means.
How do you conduct this kind of wargaming exercise, practically speaking? What is it? Are people looking at a screen? Is it a table with papers? How does it look?
Yeah, it's very exciting, I think, at least from my perspective. I mean, I think generally how these can be conducted is quite basic. It's a PowerPoint slide, a list of scenarios, a list of actions to walk them through and say a challenge and say, but what if you try and call the company but they don't pick up? What if the company is based in China rather than the US? What if you can vary the scenario various ways, and you want a scenario that both a plan that both like works for the scenario, but also is robust to many different scenarios. So you don't want to index only on, say, a US company. You don't want to only focus on one risk. You need to really make sure that's what I think resilience means, is like being prepared no matter what the risk, no matter where it's based. And by sort of stress testing different plans, you hopefully be able to tell that.
It is interesting how we need to practice these kind of low level practical and logistical details of how we might respond to an AI crisis. But when you look in for historical cases, we do have. I'm thinking during the World Wars and during the Cold Wars, you might want to respond to a crisis during the Cold War as a government, but then the person responsible for implementing that response is not reachable. And maybe that's not a problem to the same extent in our world where we have so many ways of reaching people, but I'm sure that it's a good idea to think through the practical and the logistical details of how you would actually respond.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, and it doesn't really hopefully matter who the person is. It should be like there should be a clear process agnostic of the person. And I think planning was it plans are useless, but planning is essential. I think that's like the slogan I would give to people. Like that, like it doesn't matter like exactly the scenario. We might be wrong about the timeline, but if there exists a plan, if there's some drawer in sort of, the back end of a government office that just says this is what we do, that existing alone is hopefully like going to like be more helpful than not existing.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about, we could call them low-level failures, but could it be that, say, a crisis arises and the government officials do not remember the plan that's been made, do not actually act out that plan? Do you think that the plans we're making now would actually be useful when a scenario arises?
Yeah, I think my honest opinion is like it's a good chance it's not, but like it was not a mistake to have done this, just for there's some probability that it was. And I think it really requires, refreshing institutional memory that like this exists, this is a problem. I mean, I think like one of the lowest dignity ways that like the world ends is something like we had a plan, we knew like this risk was coming, we had a sort of maybe even a solution that would have like kept this threat down, but we just like some dumb error, someone forgot to email them some of the plan, like someone forgot to read the plan. Like these are so basic errors that like I foresee happening if we don't have this like basic muscle of like what would we do in a crisis.
Is there some process for briefing government officials, high-level government officials, on these risks? So, say when a new, I don't know, a minister or prime minister comes into office, I'm assuming they're briefed on various issues. Is there a way to present them a package with information on AI risk?
Yeah, I'm not too close to sort of the specifics. I understand that when the prime minister in the UK is elected, one of their first responsibilities is to decide, like, what would you do if there was a nuclear weapons strike? Like that was one of the within the first hour that they like come into the building. That is what they have to decide after like 24 hours without sleeping or something. So it's an interesting question. I don't know if like AI features and how it features in those early days, like of sort of the prime minister, the new ministers. But yeah, my expectation is that there is some kind of briefing about like, here are the risks from AI, here's like responsibilities for them. But I'm unsure about the details on that.
So you advise the UK government. How do you think efforts on AI safety in the UK differ from efforts in the US?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier, but I think the UK is, in some sense, like a thought leader in this space, has certainly like taken this on, was the first country in the world to set up an AI safety institute, first in the world for an AI safety summit. And so has really taken like that international sort of like lens and really tried to sort of bring these countries together. Because like the truth is that like the US and China are by far the most dominant compared to the UK in terms of capabilities, but the UK has a leading role there as it's diplomatic power. So that's how it's like really differentiated itself. I think you can compare that to, say, the EU, for example, where like the AI Act was passed, covering, yes, frontier foundational AI models, but also many applications of AI, covering a whole bunch of areas in a very large sort of piece of legislation. Whereas the UK has not, to my knowledge, passed any kind of legislation specifically for AI, although there are relevant parts of other bills that might apply there. And then in the US, there is the executive order that Joe Biden passed back in 2023, and also an AI Safety Institute set up as part of that. So I think, the UK is definitely led, and there is certainly a kind of bipartisan consensus on the issue. With the US, we'll wait to see what happens in November with the election. Of course, with Kamala Harris, we should expect probably similar to Joe Biden's executive order is likely to stay. With a Trumpian presidency, it's like very unclear what happens with AI safety. There are people who are trying to work on this issue, but it's still pretty unknown right now.
being slightly pessimistic on safety work in the UK, you could say that since all of the AGI corporations are concentrated in the US, concentrated in California, that's where the real action is going on. So something like the bill SB 1047 that's in process right now is something that could actually change things, and work in the UK will be less impactful. Do you think that's an accurate picture of the situation, or do you think that UK safety work is impactful?
Yeah, I think it's a fair sort of question about like how useful the UK would be in this debate. Certainly, yeah, all the US, all the companies that are at the frontier, with the exception of perhaps DeepMind, of course, which is based in London. So yeah, I think like the US is ultimately of prime importance, but even then, when it comes to like informing what the US does, one can look to what other countries are doing, including the UK. And so I think with the safety institutes that have been set up, that was inspired by the UK. I do think like SB 1047 is going to be like particularly interesting, both if it passes, but also if that informs any future federal level regulation. So I think it's interesting to see how like different countries, different states are doing this differently. These are all ahead of the federal government, and hopefully, like, yeah, they'll see how the UK does, they'll see how California does, they'll see how the EU is doing things, and try and take the best from all those jurisdictions. But I think, yeah, to that extent, like differentiation and diversity can be useful just to like try different regulatory regimes.
Yeah, and I think that there's a real effect of governments taking inspiration from each other, to going to international meetings, and you want your country to be as well prepared and as much on the forefront as say the UK. And so I do think there's an effect there of the UK perhaps inspiring other countries into action.
Yeah, and I think there is some kind of unusual, and maybe this is a cynical view, but perspective that like it doesn't matter what we're first in as long as it's something. And so that's probably true for many countries, that they can call themselves a world leader, and UK happens to be a world leader in safety, just given like historical circumstance. But yeah, I think like my cynical take is that countries are pretty happy to be a leader in something. And that just happens to fall this way. But hopefully that can also like inspire others.
So you mentioned that you worked both under a conservative administration and under a Labour administration. What are the differences in terms of right wing, left wing here? It doesn't seem obvious to me that there would be a difference, kind of a politically partisan difference, but I'm guessing that such difference actually does arise.
Yeah, I think certainly at the high level, there's a lot of agreement that this is an issue that between Conservatives and Labour. That I think the way to like compare the contrast the approaches is that the Conservatives set up the AI Safety Institute and did the summit, but their view was very much like regulation is too early. We need to test these models. We need to like be a leader in the space, but without necessarily going straight to hard regulations. Whereas like the Labour Party committed to regulating its like most powerful AI models. What that means in practice is like an open question, but is certainly has committed to doing regulation in the way that the Conservatives did not. So I think maybe this like fits to some kind of ideological preferences around like the role of the state versus the free market, those kind of questions. But I think despite that, though, there is a remarkable level of consensus, as I say. Often the line is that we need to like balance the risks and the opportunities, and that you can only get the opportunity with the risk. I think that's a line that both parties are pretty happy to sign on to.
That's somewhat reassuring to hear. In a sense, you could predict that, say, a right-wing government would be less inclined to regulate a technology than a left-wing government would be. But I think if we are talking about very advanced AI, say superintelligence, this is outside of the bounds of normal politics, and I think there should be some ground for agreement between both sides here. And it doesn't seem obvious to me that it would be a particularly conservative position that we should not control superintelligence, say.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I completely agree. And it is, as I say, one of those few areas where we have like remarkable agreement. Also in the US, I think Republicans have said they're concerned about like AI safety, talking about like deep fakes, and maybe the way that those messages are communicated looks slightly different. So maybe Republicans complain about Silicon Valley elites and liberal elites. Maybe Democrats are more concerned about issues of like bias and discrimination. But nonetheless, I think on the frontier level, there's a surprising level of agreement. And then, as I say, the US and China as well. And I think recent reports were that like Xi Jinping himself was personally quite concerned about the existential side. And whilst, the same debate essentially is happening in the US, where we have to balance that risk with trying to get ahead of each other. And so, and the one other thing is that we thankfully saw US and China for the first time meeting on track one dialogues. I think it was on military AI issues, which is a real success.
Yeah, perhaps explain for the audience what the difference between track 1 and track 2 dialogues.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so track one dialogues are more formal briefings between the direct heads of state or parts of government between the US and China. And then we have track two dialogues, which are more informal, not led by the state, but by think tanks, by organizations around governments, but not inside government. And they can often offer like a more direct line of communication. If track one dialogues break down, then track two still exists. And there can be this informal kind of cooperation that goes on. So on the issue of like military AI Founders Pledge, we've sort of talked about this previously, funded organizations working on this issue. And thankfully, we've now seen track one dialogues. So US and China, the CCP meeting directly to discuss this. And also track two dialogues happening between Chinese AI scientists and US AI scientists. So there is a glimmer of hope there that can be ultimately a track one issue. But even if not, like the fact that there is dialogue is very, very promising in a time when the US and China are not talking about many other issues.
Yeah, and maybe what is the value of having track one dialogues going on? What is the symbolism there, and what does it signal to the administrations of both countries?
Yeah, I think there can be an enormous power in just like having the meetings take place at all. In terms of like diplomatically, it means that there is like a shared agreement that this is an issue, and it really kind of can change the debate. So if you think domestically in the US right now, a lot of people say, oh, we have to build these AI systems because China will otherwise do it. But if you have a track one dialogue where both countries say, these are systems that are concerning. They are dangerous if we're built at the frontier. If we exceed certain capabilities, we'll agree to certain conditions, maybe stopping, maybe pausing, whatever the requirements are. If such a thing happens, then the whole debate in the US domestically around like, we have to build this because otherwise China will, kind of just be shut down, because essentially there's like a federal level agreement that just won't be the case. So that's the real power of track one. And I think even then with track two dialogues, you can informally get similar kind of commitments, agreements that can really sort of change the debate and ultimately like slow those racing dynamics.
Yeah, I think even if you have track one dialogues, there might still be the issue of trust, right? So we have official communication, perhaps friendly communications and cooperative communication, but how do you then verify these good intentions are actually being implemented or are not being broken? I guess that's probably an unsolved problem, but do you see track one dialogues helping in that direction?
Yeah, I think certainly, if you can at least make the agreement a tool, that's the first step. And then, the question of like, how do you verify such an agreement? So there are sort of like academic research papers on treaty verification methods and how you would be able to like, sort of actually check. For example, if the agreement was that you can't build certain AI systems, well, how do you actually make sure that like, are they training them, where the compute clusters, and how do you know what they're being used for? There are sort of like questions in the air about how you do that. And like, alongside like the agreement to do it, you also need the research to actually figure out concretely what to do. But I often think that like you can solve the question of how to do it after you've got a question of whether we want to do it. If the US and China are both motivated to solve this problem, then they can invest resource in it. They can think about like verification methods that will work. But that often is like requires the first step is an agreement that this matters at all.
We might be somewhat lucky in terms of giant AI training runs being quite resource intensive and taking up perhaps a lot of space on the ground. Maybe they are visible from satellite imagery, and so it might be easier to verify whether such training runs are taking place compared to verifying nuclear weapons stocks, for example.
Yeah, I think for as long as we have these like giant training clusters, it certainly might be an option. I think one question is like, as the cost of compute decreases, will they still be of the same size? And also, if it's like distributed sort of training across many different centers, then it might be hard. But even then, like maybe open source intelligence can see if are there spikes in energy usage in particular parts of countries? Are there other kind of like signs that are signals that suggest maybe training is happening? And again, I think this gives some kind of indication for verification, but I think that ultimately what needed is more formal commitments agreements that, maybe inspections maybe kind of, or similar could be required. And I have to also balance that with the infosecurity side of things, because of course, we don't want people using their opportunity to sort of inspect to maybe like take AI level access.
And another option here might be compute governance at the hardware level, where you could call US export restrictions on advanced AI chips a beginning version of this or a embryonic version of this, But we can imagine a scenario in which chips have certain restrictions on which training runs can be done using those chips.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think there's a really excellent report that came out a few months ago from Center for Governance of AI on this question about, the analogies between compute governance and like the governance of like uranium for nuclear weapons. And I think, they really do offer a node of governance. I think like still it's more of a theoretical idea right now. It's not like a thing that, the US is doing beyond, as you say, the CHIPS Act. But I think in future there could be, but especially if there's some kind of agreement there, that could be quite absolute.
As I mentioned, your report focuses on how philanthropists can use their money to make sure that developing advanced AI goes well. One option you mentioned here is building out government capacity. This means equipping policymakers to build out the regulations required to meet this kind of grand challenge. I do wonder whether we have historical examples of this actually working, whether we have examples of some philanthropists sponsoring some build-up of state capacity, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the clearest case of this would be back in the 1990s, where sort of the Soviet Union had collapsed, and there's a real question about what happens to nuclear weapons following that collapse. And philanthropists were the first to kind of like really notice and pay attention to this problem, because if these nuclear weapons were not de-escalated like properly with government oversight, maybe it would fall into the hands of rogue states to terrorists. So a real concern was there, and it was philanthropists who first drew that attention, and then they really worked closely with government in Congress in the US, often writing large parts of the bill that eventually was passed as an act. So I think there's a really strong case there that because of that philanthropic intervention, we've managed to avoid this problem of maybe loose nukes. Who knows how many lives that could have saved compared to if it had been an issue. So I think that's a clear case in the nuclear space. In terms of AI, I think it's yet to be seen. The AI Safety Institute is one example where philanthropists initially talked about AI safety as an issue. They got it on the agenda of politicians, and subsequently governments have now invested in the issue. They've set up these institutes. So I think it's the theory of change is harder to see there. It's not so strong a link, but I think philanthropists can raise the alarm, and then governments can answer by setting up such institutes.
Perhaps in that vein, you also would talk about facilitating cooperation. And this is cooperation both between leading AI corporations, but also between countries. Why would facilitating coordination be important, and why is that a good option for philanthropic effort?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this goes back to the question on racing dynamics and how we can prevent such an arms race on AI, both on the domestic and the international level. In terms of the role for philanthropy there, I think the Track 2 dialogues are especially promising. So they're a place where, philanthropists really are the only ones who can step in, because governments cannot fund Track 2s in the same way, because it would cloud the perception of the Track 2 in many respects, and private companies are not going to. So it really is a space that only philanthropy can on the international side. And then also domestically, I think just setting up forums, conferences, meetings between AI companies to really get them to come to agreements, voluntary commitments, these kind of things. There's a Frontier Model Forum, for example, that's been set up. And I think these establishments can be supportive of philanthropy that, again, we shouldn't expect private companies to do it. We've seen issues why governments won't do it. So I think that's the only remaining option.
And you mentioned in the report that most AI risk is driven by coordination failures. Why is that the case? And you also write that these coordination failures are probably going to become worse over time. So maybe explain that.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think the first thing to note is how frequent coordination issues are in terms of the various risks we talk about. So in the power-seeking AI case, a key issue is that a company wants to deploy a model that may be unsafe because they're concerned about another party. So we have a coordination issue there. In the case of biological weapons, we often face that the issues of many people able to access such tools. And so there is a widespread unilateral access. And in military AI issues, in issues of democratic distributional risks, again, the key issue there is not a single actor, but rather multiple actors who might in conflict with each other. Also, in the case with power-seeking AI in particular, as the cost of compute comes down, the cost of building these models decreases. We get more and more and more actors. So I think unilateral occurs is a key example here. So maybe one company or two companies is going to build these systems safely, but we don't know if the 10th or the 20th or the 100th will. And so at some point, we get to a coordination issue. And then finally, I think just like the number of people who want to have these catastrophes is actually extremely low, thankfully. There are a very, very, very small number of people who want these issues to occur. So what that tells you is not that there is some unilateral actor acting like evil or recklessly, but more often the case is that multiple people acting often in good faith end up causing many of these issues. So again and again and again, I think coordination is one of the key sources of risks.
And the reasoning there would be others might act irresponsibly, so we have to race to get to advanced AI first, such that we can prevent them from acting irresponsibly. And then everyone is racing, even if everyone is well-intentioned and actually takes these risks seriously.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it's a real tragedy that this happens, and we've already seen this. I think it's also, ultimately it's a flawed logic. I think there are decision theoretic reasons to suspect this is like a bad course of actions because they're reasoning in a poor way about how others will act. And I think there are solutions that they could be pursuing in terms of other decision theories they could apply. I also think that just like, if we look at like the Manhattan Project, for example, it's a similar case where we had to supposedly build this weapon because maybe Germany was doing it, and then that was no longer the case. Then we had to do it for Japan, and then Russia or the Soviet Union was then the threat, where there was always some kind of imagined enemy. And I think the vast majority of like physicists there were acting in good intent, but ultimately led to this weapon being created. There were a few rare examples of people who said they wanted to step away because even then they thought the logic was flawed. And so I think when we see people, for example, at OpenAI taking a similar path, who are saying, even though I think that these risks are real, I cannot be part of a company that sort of pursues this. So yeah, I think that's like a real sort of shining example of what to do.
That's interesting to me because it seems like if you believe that OpenAI is ahead, say, and they're developing advanced AI, maybe even if you disagree with the direction the company is going in, you should try to stay at the company, say if you're working on safety, and try to do the best you can. That's at least an argument that I have heard, but you have some reason for disagreeing with that.
Yeah, I think it is a debate, and it's one that's often discussed. I think I do come down on the view that I think like often in practice this is just really hard to do well. I think if one goes into these companies thinking that they're going to change them from the inside, I think this is just like really difficult, maybe ineffective to do.
You're working against strong incentives, which is not a position you want to be in.
Exactly. If your job and your livelihood is on the line, it's very, very hard to stand up. And I think maybe there's like a consequentialist type of reasoning that says maybe you can change it, but also I think some non-consequentialist values about integrity and sort of like having strong red lines that you will not cross is just really, really important. Just like from a basic moral perspective, even if you think the logic holds out on paper, you have to have some line somewhere.
I do worry, though, that what you then end up with is only the people who are least concerned about safety working at the most advanced corporations.
Yeah, I think that is certainly a risk, and one has to try and weigh up whether that's like worse than leaving. But I think, firstly, the integrity point, but then secondly, I think if you can really make this like publicly known that this is a risk, then even the people who are less concerned might start to be nervous, and there might be some kind of knock-on effects that it's hard to see in the moment. But I think often there will be a spectrum where people who are most concerned might leave first, and then the next group of people might be slightly more concerned, and so on and so on. And I think with OpenAI there has been a lot of people who have resigned who are not all motivated just by safety very strongly, but even who are sympathetic, who are now more nervous. So I think there's a lesson there.
Let's try to step back a moment and then ask, like, what does success look like here? Because what we've talked about a bunch of challenges that we face. What does it mean, for example, to say, okay, we have solved these problems to our satisfaction, and we should now try to actually develop and deploy advanced AI?
Yeah, it is a good point, and I'm glad for the question. I think as you spend too long on the risk side of things, it's worth remembering like what is this all for? And I think ultimately, it's worth like if we succeed, what happens, and like poverty is a massive issue, right? Inequality, destruction of the environment, climate change, all these issues. Often these like can be solved with AI systems if they're sufficiently smart. But I think that's like just the lower bounds. Of course, if you think about the long-term future, if you're interested in sort of like seeing humanity really thriving as a civilization across the galaxy, the potential is just astronomical. And I think I'm fundamentally of the view that would be a really positive thing. And That's why it's so sort of tragic to see like our attempts to try and get there just a little bit faster coming at the cost of these risks. There is no need to accelerate because we will get to the stars eventually. It's kind of my view. Like we really will like, colonize the galaxies and really have flourishing human societies. And that is like a real thing to look forward to. But we can't do that if we go extinct. And that is like a really basic point. And I get really frustrated by people who are on the accelerationist side who think that they are like the optimistic people in the room. Like they are, missing the point that we all want the same thing. We're just like, we can wait a few more years, like the galaxies are going to be around for trillions. So we can wait a little bit longer.
One other approach that you mentioned in your report is that you could try to boost a global resilience, where this means preparing for kind of worst case scenarios. You have some examples of this. One is contingency planning. Maybe we discussed this when we talked about war games and planning in governments in general, but which institutions should do contingency planning? Is this, how would you implement such planning?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think governments are the key there. That federal, central government, UK government, others should be the core there. Also, companies should have clear like protocols and practices for escalating that information. So I think that's like contingency planning, crisis planning is like one core component of this. I think like other parts of this resilience piece is also just like having mechanisms for like shutting down these systems. Having it really easy both to literally pull the plug, but more broadly having ways to really sort of rein in these systems. And then I think like the final part of this is thinking about like ways that AI systems might try and take over and really closing off those loopholes. So take the mindset of like an AI system, trying to disempower humanity. What are some of your plausible pathways? You might try and engineer a pandemic. You might try and launch a massive cyber attack. There are many other pathways, but what we could do is try and reduce that chance now, which really sort of like closes that loophole, which makes it harder for an AI system to take over. And by building up those defenses, you're really sort of making us more resilient. And some people might say, well, eventually the system is going to be smarter than you anyway, so it's going to exceed those barriers. But at the very least, we can buy some time by closing off these kind of like open threat models.
You mentioned the shutdown mechanisms. There, I guess the worry is that the cure might be worse than the disease. And if you build up a way to shut down AI development globally, what would be required to build such a system would be extremely dangerous to create. And I'm thinking of kind of authoritarian control over technology. Yeah, how do we balance those risks?
Yeah, I think it requires one to be like very clear about exactly when you would and would not use them and like under what conditions, and also like when you would no longer apply such rules. Like maybe, I think one real concern in the past with things like terrorism, for example, is, we say we're going to bring in some kind of like safety measure to like prevent, future attacks, and then such like sort of authoritarian policies never get removed. So I think like being really clear on the conditions in which you'd apply such a break, a pause, a shutdown is really important. I think the other thing is that these measures don't necessarily have to be highly costly. They can be simply for only companies that really build systems that are both of a certain size of capability in compute, and also in terms of you showing clear like dangerous risks, existential risks. Only then, and that is a really small minority of companies will be affected, then you just have to pull the plug. And you can be very clear that like, this doesn't prevent them from future developing models. They just have to pass a certain bar and they have to make sure that they're safe. But so I think the number of cases where you use this is really quite small, and hopefully that can hold off the threat that we're having government surveillance. I think the real challenge is, of course, as the cost of building the systems comes down, more companies come into this sort of this zone of regulation, and then you have to be more active. My hope is that we can build safe systems that avoid that, but we will see.
You also write about psychological defense. This is actually an interesting framing in my view. What I see it as is as AI becomes more advanced, we will become more and more influenced by it. We see an early version of that with social media now, which is already driving some people insane, I would say. And so we can imagine the AI-powered version of that. What could such psychological defense, what would it consist of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we see like with Anthropic, for example, they like do evaluations for their AI models on like persuasion and manipulation and seeing if they are capable of doing that. One solution, and this is not like well thought through, but you could try and test people to see how easily like persuaded they are by AI models. Maybe they are more easy to manipulate or harder to manipulate, and you can try and like develop mechanisms for really testing like people's psychological ability to be manipulated by these systems or not, and you want the people who are like least manipulatable to be in charge of like keeping such systems safe. And the reason for that is, again, like you might say, well, eventually the systems will be more smart than humans. They can manipulate any human being, but before they can manipulate every human being, they have to manipulate only some. And if you can at least hold off until it makes basically you're making it really expensive to these AI systems to take over. It's not just a case that you can get into a wet lab and build some pandemic pathogen and then release it. You really have to also manipulate people, and these people are going to be really strong in terms of like resistance to that manipulation. You also have to navigate computer systems that are also really quite secure, and all these kind of defenses. Each of them may fail, but you want to sort of have a defense in depth strategy where you are building all these different kinds of defenses against a system: psychological, personal, cyber, physical, and you're hoping that like something will succeed. And of course, like who knows? Like we may like be really bad at stopping cyber attacks from AI systems, but maybe we can still be good at psychological defenses. So I think as many we can build is the better.
And these psychological defenses would be useful in a situation, say, where an AI system is trying to convince someone to plug in a server to the internet or plug this USB drive into this and that computer, or go make this synthetic virus for me. And so you would do some form of screening to make sure that only very stable and non-persuadable individuals are in positions where they have to kind of contain these systems.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's the sort of idea I have in mind. I mean, as I say, it's not something we've like sort of thought deeply about. I think there's not been much research on this area yet, but I think it's probably falls into standard intro security work as well, and just having people who are like, I'm not going to give away information. Make sure that like it's secure and contained. It should be something that is focused on. And again, like I say, it could be all nonsense. It could all be silly to doing this, but like it seems worth throwing whatever sticks at this kind of problem, and as many different layers of security which are different layers that you're really sort of preventing threats getting through.
I do think longer term it might be difficult because there will be commercial incentives to develop systems that are very good at persuasion. I think one of the first commercial applications of large language models is in sales and kind of customer service. And there, I think being able to persuade people is a real asset. So I do think these systems will be pretty good at it. You can imagine then the video call version with a generated person that's even more persuadable. There are kind of buttons you can push for humans where our psychological defenses break down.
Yeah, I think certainly, I wouldn't think this is like a fail-safe at all. I think probably at some level, human systems could manipulate basically any human being. But I think, just giving that extra kind of like layer, and if you just evaluate how persuadable AI systems can be to humans, if you just, do tests over time and see with future models, are they getting increasingly persuasive? Is it 20% or 50% or 80% of people who are then believing sort of things AI systems create that are false? Like that's a basic evaluation you can run to at least sort of inform this.
Yeah, I wonder if we can use AI to defend against AI in this particular scenario. So I'm imagining a model that is trying to preserve your sanity, trying to make sure you're making decisions that are aligned with your previously stated intentions and motives. And you can imagine such a system pinging you, talking to you, should you really plug in this USB? Should you really send these instructions for creating a synthetic virus to this biological lab, and so on? Yeah. Do you think we could use AI to defend against AI in this psychological sense?
I think it's certainly a possibility. I don't know how much thinking has gone into that, but if there are AI systems we know that are able to persuade people, we may also know how to prevent them from doing so as well. So, and I guess like one challenge might be that you might have weaker systems trying to defend against stronger systems. And so you'd have to try and figure out if there's some way to prevent that. But if there's a specialized system just in maybe psychological defenses, perhaps that could get some more generally capable, strong intelligence. So I think there's like a lot of interesting questions there. And I think it's one that I haven't really seen much thinking about. So it'd be really interested to see, what solutions can come.
You manage what is called the Patient Philanthropy Fund. What is this fund, and what's the idea behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I guess like we've talked a lot about like AI and the risks it poses right now, or maybe in the next 3 to 5 years. So I think the Patient Philanthropy Funds is taking quite a different perspective. So this is an approach, a philosophy that's come about in the last few years, which basically says that in order to have the most impact, it might not be necessarily best to spend all our resources, all our time and money on these threats today, but rather save for the future, invest for the future. And so you can think in the AI case, if we see AI systems that are only capable, of these like risks in 50 years or 100 years, then it will be a real mistake to spend all our money now and then only be left with nothing for those futures. So the core idea essentially is that by saving money, we can compound our interest on that. And so if you put $1,000 in, today, 7% return a year, maybe that's like 2 times as much in 10 years. That's about 10 times as much in 35 years. There's this example from Benjamin Franklin back in the 1790s who put $1,000, I think it was, into Boston, into Philadelphia. And by the 1990s, when that money was finally spent, it was, in the millions of dollars. So there's like a real sort of historic example here of how you can actually have quite a large impact. And so that's where the idea came from. And in Founders Pledge, we set up this fund in 2021 based on that premise. And it's been growing now. And we're at, I think, $2.5 million approximately. And already, $500,000 of that approximately is, extra money that we would not have had available if we'd spent the money 2-3 years ago. So merely by being patient, merely by sort of saving that money, we now have extra capital to deploy, AI risks, biological risks, nuclear risks that we would not have been able to do. And so, yes, it's very early days. Hopefully this fund will maybe be around for centuries, but already we're starting to see the benefits.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you might regret having spent all your money early. The other side of that coin, as I'm sure you're aware, is that you might regret having a bunch of money if you've lost control of the future because AI have taken over, right? And if this is really a crucial time to deploy capital, how do you make that decision? I know this is a massive question, but it's interesting, not only for the Patient Philanthropy Fund, but for basically all philanthropists. How should Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Mark Zuckerberg deploy their capital in terms of expectations of technological progress and trying to predict how crucial the current moment is?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it is a massive, massive question. I think my average is, I'm very uncertain about this question. I've put some credence in these AI systems being built in the next 5 years. I also think it could be 50 plus years, and not just AI, but also nuclear threats, biological threats. We don't know if the war is going to get worse or better. But given that uncertainty, I think it makes sense to hedge across a bunch of those different worlds. So, I put some funding and resource into threats today, some into next 10 to 30 years, maybe 50 plus years. And I think just having that diversified portfolio is quite important. The Patient Philanthropy Fund itself is a very small fraction of the total amount of money in this AI and GCR space. But it is also the only fund focused on this. So even if you're only putting aside a couple of percent towards 50 or 100 years or beyond, that is still probably worth doing about having literally 0%. And I think there is no argument in principle I wouldn't deploy much sooner if the time was right. If in the next 10 years we really were in a crisis, it would deploy then. It would just have to meet a very high bar for giving out all that funding. So you would have to see all these other major philanthropists also donating a bunch, or it also makes sense to add in that extra capital.
You could talk about it as sort of compounding on the in terms of impact also. Say you're funding the UK AI Safety Institute. You funded that today, and the efforts there compound over time, and so the impact compound over time. How would you compare the compounding, so to speak, that's happening on the impact side versus kind of pure monetary compounding?
Yeah, absolutely. I think ultimately we care about the impact side of things, of course. And so financial returns are one component, but there are others. So for example, learning gains. So maybe you spend your money today on your best guess, but maybe in 1, 2, 5, 10 years later, you'll have more wisdom, more foresight to think actually all the most more promising opportunities. With AI, that seems to be the case where, previously we didn't really know what we were doing. And now I think there are much more clearer policies and interventions to funding. That seems only possible because of those learning gains. So I don't know, putting a number on that is very hard. It's not, okay, we're learning 5% more a year, 10% more a year. But I think there's some kind of learning rate we should account for there, which adds to the case for being patient. Even if you think these risks are in the not too distant future, you can at least maybe spend 5-10 years more thinking about where it's best to give and then giving rather than today.
As a final and perhaps less serious question, are there any books or concepts or, say, podcasts that you would recommend to listeners? Perhaps something that's fairly small and not well known.
Yeah, it's a good question. My colleague Christian Rule, who came on the podcast previously, has recommended this book to me many, many times, and I'll recommend it again now. But the three body problem, I think, is I'm a big fan of that. I've just been getting into the trilogy, and I think has some interesting overlaps of questions here around future intelligences and aliens and interesting sort of implications there. So I think, I'm not a massive sci-fi fan, but that one's I really enjoyed recently. And there was also a recent Netflix show, which I wasn't as a big fan of, but worth checking out.
That's the fiction side. Do you also have a non-fiction recommendation, perhaps?
I recently read a book about, I would say like semi autobiographical about John von Neumann, which was very interesting. It was about, like intelligence and history weaved into analogies about AI. So I thought it was like a very interesting sort of read, and I would recommend that. The name escapes me, so I'll have to find that.
I'm guessing it was the one written by Bhattacharya. The author's name is Bhattacharya. I might actually have it in my bookshelf behind me. But I do, for listeners, I do recommend reading about von Neumann, who is a truly extraordinary person.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, Tom, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.